The desert wind howled across the barren landscape of New Mexico territory as Jacob Redfeather pressed his weathered hand against the jagged scar that ran from his left shoulder to his chest. The mark had been with him since childhood, a constant reminder of the night his Apache village was attacked by cavalry soldiers 30 years ago. But tonight, something was different. The scar burned with an intensity he had never felt before, pulsing like a heartbeat beneath his copper skin. As he rode his horse through the canyon near Santa Fe, the burning sensation grew stronger, and for the first time in decades, Jacob began to hear whispers in the ancient tongue of his people, voices that seemed to rise from the very earth beneath him. Jacob had spent most of his adult life as a scout for the territorial government, using his knowledge of the harsh terrain and Apache customs to help settlers navigate the dangerous wilderness. His mixed heritage made him an outsider in both worlds, too Apache for the white settlers, too assimilated for the remaining tribal communities. The scar was his most visible reminder of the violence that had shaped his life, received when he was just 12 years old during a raid on his village near the Gila River. His mother had died that night, along with most of his extended family, leaving him orphaned and eventually taken in by a missionary family in Tucson. But as Jacob dismounted near a cluster of ancient petroglyphs carved into the red sandstone, the voices grew clearer. They spoke in the old Apache dialect his grandmother had taught him as a child, words he hadn't heard in years. The burning in his scar intensified, and suddenly the world around him began to shift and blur. The modern territorial landscape faded, replaced by visions of his ancestors moving through these same canyons generations before any white man had set foot in the region. He saw warriors on horseback, women gathering medicinal plants, children playing near streams that had long since dried up. The first hook came when Jacob noticed that one of the warriors in his vision bore the exact same scar on his chest. This ancestor, whose name whispered to him as Nailnish, moved with purpose through the canyon, leading Jacob's vision deeper into the past. But something was wrong with this historical scene. Among the Apache warriors, Jacob could see the uniforms of cavalry soldiers, not as enemies, but as allies fighting alongside his people against a common threat that remained hidden in the shadows of the vision. As the burning sensation reached its peak, Jacob collapsed to his knees, his hands pressed firmly against the ancient petroglyphs. The stone was warm to the touch, almost alive, and through it he could feel the presence of countless Apache souls who had walked this land before him. The voices grew stronger, more urgent, speaking of a betrayal that had been hidden for generations, a secret that had died with his mother and the other elders of his village. They spoke of a sacred duty that had been passed down through his bloodline, a responsibility that only he could fulfill now that he had reached the age of spiritual awakening. The vision transported Jacob back to the night his village was attacked, but this time he saw the events through different eyes. The raid hadn't been a random act of military aggression against the Apache. Instead, it had been orchestrated by a group of corrupt territorial officials who had discovered something valuable hidden in the traditional Apache burial grounds near the village. His mother and the other tribal leaders had been protecting an ancient secret, something so important that they were willing to die rather than reveal its location to the wrong people. Jacob watched in horror as his childhood memories rearranged themselves before his eyes. The cavalry captain who had led the raid, a man named Colonel Morrison, hadn't been following official orders. He had been working with a secret group of treasure hunters and corrupt government officials who believed the Apache were hoarding gold or silver in their sacred places. The attack on the village had been a cover story to search for this supposed treasure, and when the tribal leaders refused to cooperate, Morrison had ordered his men to kill everyone who might know the truth. But the treasure the colonel and his men had been seeking wasn't gold or silver at all. Hidden in the burial grounds were ancient artifacts of immense spiritual power, items that had been passed down through Apache generations since time immemorial. These artifacts contained knowledge about the land itself, about the spiritual forces that connected all living things to the earth and sky. Jacob's mother had been the keeper of this knowledge, and in the moments before her death, she had somehow transferred this responsibility to her young son through the very scar that now burned on his chest. The second hook revealed itself as Jacob realized that Colonel Morrison was still alive, now serving as a territorial judge in Albuquerque. The corrupt official had spent 30 years building his political career on the foundation of that night's violence, using his military reputation to gain power and influence throughout New Mexico territory. But more disturbing still, Morrison had never stopped searching for the Apache artifacts. He had been systematically hunting down and eliminating anyone who might have knowledge of their location, including other survivors from Jacob's village who had scattered across the territory after the attack. As the vision began to fade, Jacob understood that the burning in his scar was a warning. His ancestors were trying to tell him that Morrison had finally discovered his identity and location. The corrupt judge had learned that one of the children from the attacked village had survived and grown to adulthood, and he was now closing in on Jacob's position. The spiritual awakening Jacob was experiencing wasn't just a connection to his heritage. It was a call to action, a demand that he fulfill the sacred duty his mother had died protecting. Jacob rose to his feet, his mind reeling from the revelations. The petroglyphs on the stone wall before him seemed different now, their meaning clear for the first time in his life. They weren't just decorative carvings or historical records. They were a map, showing the location of the hidden artifacts and the sacred burial ground where his ancestors had kept them safe for generations. The symbols he had seen countless times during his childhood suddenly made sense, revealing a complex system of landmarks and directions that would lead him to the place his people had died defending. But Jacob also realized he wasn't alone in this quest. As he prepared to mount his horse and ride toward the location indicated by the petroglyphs, he heard the sound of approaching riders in the distance. Colonel Morrison had found him, bringing with him a group of armed men who would stop at nothing to claim the Apache artifacts for themselves. The corrupt judge had waited 30 years for this moment, and he wasn't about to let the last keeper of the ancient knowledge slip away into the night. The chase that followed would take Jacob through some of the most treacherous terrain in New Mexico territory. He rode hard through narrow canyons and across windswept mesas, using every trick his Apache heritage had taught him about surviving in the harsh desert environment. Behind him, Morrison and his men pursued relentlessly, their horses' hooves echoing off the canyon walls as they closed the distance between hunter and prey. Jacob knew that his only chance of survival lay in reaching the sacred burial ground before his pursuers, but the location was still miles away across dangerous territory that would test both his endurance and his spiritual resolve. As Jacob rode through the night, the burning in his scar continued to guide him, growing stronger when he traveled in the right direction and fading when he strayed from the path his ancestors had set for him. The voices of his people accompanied him on his journey, sharing stories and wisdom that had been lost for generations. He learned about the true history of his tribe, about conflicts and alliances that had never been recorded in the white man's history books. Most importantly, he discovered the real nature of the artifacts he was sworn to protect. The sacred objects weren't treasures in any conventional sense. They were repositories of knowledge, containing the accumulated wisdom of Apache shamans and spiritual leaders stretching back hundreds of years. The artifacts held information about healing practices, agricultural techniques, and spiritual ceremonies that could help the Apache people survive and thrive in an increasingly hostile world dominated by white settlement and military oppression. More than that, they contained prophecies about the future of the land itself, warnings about what would happen if the natural balance between human civilization and the environment was disrupted. Jacob began to understand why his mother and the other tribal leaders had been willing to die rather than let these artifacts fall into the wrong hands. In the possession of corrupt men like Colonel Morrison, the ancient knowledge could be twisted and exploited for personal gain rather than used for the benefit of all people who called this land home. The artifacts represented not just Apache heritage, but a way of understanding and respecting the natural world that was desperately needed as more settlers poured into the territory. As dawn broke over the New Mexico landscape, Jacob finally reached the area indicated by the petroglyphs. The sacred burial ground was hidden in a narrow canyon that could only be accessed through a series of natural stone arches and hidden passages. The place had been chosen by his ancestors specifically because it was difficult to find and easy to defend, a natural fortress where the most important elements of Apache culture could be preserved for future generations. But as Jacob dismounted and began searching for the exact location of the artifacts, he realized that Colonel Morrison had anticipated his destination. The corrupt judge and his men had taken a different route through the canyon system, using their knowledge of military tactics to position themselves between Jacob and his goal. Morrison emerged from behind a cluster of large boulders, his weapon drawn and a triumphant smile on his weathered face. The confrontation between Jacob and Colonel Morrison revealed the full extent of the corruption that had shaped both their lives for the past 30 years. Morrison admitted that the attack on Jacob's village had been part of a larger conspiracy involving territorial officials, mining companies, and military officers who were working together to exploit the natural resources of Apache lands. The artifacts had been just one part of a systematic effort to eliminate any obstacles to their plans for development and resource extraction. But Morrison had underestimated the spiritual power that Jacob had inherited from his ancestors. As the two men faced each other in the ancient burial ground, the burning in Jacob's scar reached a crescendo that seemed to connect him directly to the wisdom and strength of generations of Apache warriors and spiritual leaders. The artifacts themselves began to respond to his presence, emanating an energy that Morrison and his men could feel but not understand. The final twist came when Jacob realized that Morrison wasn't just after the artifacts for their material value. The corrupt judge had become obsessed with Apache spirituality over the years, convinced that the ancient knowledge contained secrets that could grant him power over life and death itself. Morrison believed that by possessing the sacred objects, he could somehow absorb the spiritual strength of the Apache people and use it to extend his own life and influence indefinitely. This revelation horrified Jacob, who understood that allowing Morrison to touch the artifacts would be a desecration that could destroy not just the physical objects, but the spiritual connection they represented between the Apache people and their ancestral lands. The confrontation became not just a battle for possession of ancient treasures, but a fight for the very soul of the territory and the people who called it home. The climactic battle between Jacob and Morrison's forces took place among the ancient burial sites, where the spirits of Jacob's ancestors seemed to take an active role in the conflict. Strange winds rose without warning, disorienting Morrison's men and giving Jacob tactical advantages he used with deadly effectiveness. The corrupt judge found his weapons misfiring and his horses becoming uncontrollable, as if the land itself was rejecting his presence in this sacred space. When the dust settled, Jacob stood victorious but forever changed by his experience. The artifacts were safe, hidden once again in their ancient resting place, but Jacob now understood that his role as their protector was just beginning. The spiritual awakening triggered by his burning scar had connected him not just to his Apache heritage, but to a larger responsibility for preserving indigenous wisdom and protecting the land from those who would exploit it without regard for its sacred nature. In the end, Jacob chose not to return to his life as a territorial scout. Instead, he disappeared into the vast wilderness of New Mexico territory, becoming a legend among both Apache and white communities. Some said he had died in the confrontation with Morrison, while others claimed to have seen him traveling through remote canyons and desert regions, always moving, always protecting the ancient secrets that had been entrusted to his care. The scar on his chest no longer burned with pain, but glowed with a warm light that reminded him constantly of his connection to the ancestors who continued to guide his steps through the challenging landscape of the American Southwest. As the years passed after that fateful confrontation in the sacred burial ground, Jacob Redfeather became something of a phantom throughout New Mexico territory. Settlers and Apache alike would share stories around campfires of a scarred man who appeared at moments of great need, always arriving when the balance between the natural world and human ambition threatened to collapse entirely. Some claimed he could predict where water would be found during the worst droughts, while others swore they had seen him communicating with wild animals in ways that defied rational explanation. The territorial government officially listed Jacob as missing and presumed dead, closing the file on his disappearance without investigation. This suited Jacob perfectly, as it allowed him to move freely through the landscape without the burden of his former identity as a government scout. Colonel Morrison's death in the canyon had been ruled an accident by the corrupt officials who had been part of his conspiracy, but those same officials found themselves facing a series of mysterious setbacks in their plans to exploit Apache lands. Mining operations would fail when equipment broke down inexplicably, and survey teams would become lost in terrain they thought they knew well. Jacob's connection to the ancient artifacts had fundamentally changed his relationship with the physical world around him. The burning scar had evolved into something like a compass, guiding him toward places and situations where the old knowledge could be put to use. He found himself drawn to remote settlements where Apache families were struggling to survive, appearing with food, medicine, and practical advice before disappearing again into the wilderness. White settlers who showed genuine respect for the land and its original inhabitants would sometimes find their crops mysteriously protected from drought or disease. But Jacob's most important work involved tracking down and protecting the remaining survivors from his childhood village. Over the course of a decade, he located nearly 24 Apache people who had scattered across the territory after that terrible night 30 years ago. Many had taken new names and tried to blend into white society, while others had joined different tribal groups or retreated to the most remote areas of the desert. Jacob worked patiently to reconnect these survivors with their heritage, sharing the wisdom he had gained from the artifacts while teaching them to recognize the signs of their ancestors' continuing presence in the world. The reunion of these scattered Apache families became a gradual process of spiritual and cultural healing that extended far beyond Jacob's original mission. The survivors began to form a loose network of communication and mutual support, sharing resources and information while maintaining the appearance of living separate lives. They developed new ceremonies that honored their ancestors while adapting to the realities of life in an increasingly white-dominated territory. Most importantly, they began training their children in the old ways, ensuring that Apache knowledge and traditions would survive even if the physical artifacts remained hidden. Jacob's own understanding of his role continued to evolve as he witnessed the impact of his work on the broader Apache community. The artifacts had not just been repositories of ancient knowledge, but catalysts for the renewal and adaptation of living cultural practices. Through his connections with the scattered survivors, Jacob realized that the true treasure his mother and the other tribal leaders had died protecting was not a collection of physical objects, but the living spirit of Apache identity itself. As Jacob aged, his appearances became less frequent but more significant. He would emerge from the wilderness at crucial moments in territorial history, using his knowledge and spiritual connections to influence events in ways that protected Apache interests without revealing his presence to hostile authorities. When new waves of settlers arrived with plans that would devastate sacred sites, Jacob would find ways to redirect their attention to less sensitive areas. When military commanders planned aggressive campaigns against remaining Apache communities, they would discover that their scouts had provided faulty intelligence or that their supply lines had become mysteriously unreliable. The mystery of Jacob's continued presence in the territory became part of regional folklore, with stories growing more elaborate with each telling. Some claimed he had become immortal through his connection to the ancient artifacts, while others believed he was actually a spirit who appeared in physical form only when needed. The truth was more complex and more human than these legends suggested. Jacob aged normally, but his deep spiritual connection to the land and his people seemed to sustain him through hardships that would have broken other men. In his final years, Jacob began training a successor, a young Apache woman named Maria Santos who had demonstrated unusual sensitivity to the spiritual forces that surrounded the hidden artifacts. Maria was the daughter of one of the survivors Jacob had located, and she had grown up hearing stories of the massacre that had shaped her people's recent history. When Jacob first approached her, the scar on his chest glowed with the same warm light that had guided him for decades, but Maria's eyes reflected that light back at him, indicating her readiness to accept the responsibility he had carried alone for so long. The process of transferring the guardianship of the artifacts required Maria to undergo the same kind of spiritual transformation that Jacob had experienced in the canyon years earlier. Under his guidance, she learned to interpret the messages contained in the ancient objects and to understand her role as a bridge between the world of the ancestors and the needs of living Apache communities. The burning scar that had marked Jacob as the keeper of ancient secrets gradually faded as Maria developed her own spiritual connection to the artifacts and their power. Jacob's final act as guardian was to lead Maria to each of the hidden locations where artifacts were concealed throughout New Mexico territory. There were more sites than anyone had suspected, forming a network of sacred places that stretched across hundreds of miles of desert and mountain terrain. Each location required different skills and knowledge to access safely, and Jacob spent months teaching Maria the complex system of signs, ceremonies, and practical techniques that were needed to maintain the security of these ancient treasures. When Jacob finally passed away peacefully in a hidden canyon near the original burial ground where his journey had begun, His body seemed to merge naturally with the red sandstone and desert soil that had shaped his life. Maria performed the traditional burial ceremonies, but she discovered that Jacob's physical remains had somehow become part of the landscape itself, as if the land had reclaimed one of its most devoted protectors. The scar that had marked his chest for so many years was found carved into the stone wall of the canyon, joining the ancient petroglyphs that had first revealed his destiny to him. Maria continued Jacob's work for the next generation, adapting his methods to the changing realities of territorial life as New Mexico moved toward statehood. She established a more formal network of Apache families who could communicate and coordinate their efforts to preserve their cultural heritage while navigating the complex challenges of assimilation and survival. The artifacts remained safely hidden, but their influence continued to guide and strengthen Apache communities throughout the region. The legend of Jacob Redfeather persisted long after his death, inspiring new generations of Apache people to maintain their connection to ancestral lands and traditional knowledge. Historians would eventually acknowledge that the period of Jacob's guardianship had coincided with an unusual stability in Apache-white relations throughout New Mexico territory, though they could never identify the specific factors that had contributed to this relatively peaceful era. The true explanation remained known only to the Apache families who had been touched by Jacob's work and who continued to benefit from the wisdom he had preserved and shared. In the end, Jacob's story became proof that the most important treasures are not gold or silver, but the living connections between people, land, and heritage that sustain communities through even the most difficult historical periods. The burning scar that had awakened him to his destiny had been both a wound and a gift, marking him as someone capable of bridging different worlds and protecting what was most precious about each of them. His legacy lived on not in monuments or written records, but in the continuing strength and adaptability of the Apache people he had served with such dedication and courage. Years after Maria Santos had taken over as guardian of the ancient artifacts, strange reports began filtering in from across New Mexico territory that suggested Jacob Redfeather's influence had not ended with his physical death. Railroad workers constructing new lines through Apache territories would describe encounters with a scarred man who would appear at construction sites where the proposed routes threatened sacred burial grounds or ceremonial locations. These mysterious visits always resulted in unexpected engineering problems that forced the railroad companies to alter their plans, routing their tracks around the most spiritually significant areas without ever understanding why their original surveys had proven faulty. Maria discovered that Jacob's spiritual essence had become permanently woven into the landscape he had protected for so long. During her own meditative connections with the artifacts, she would sometimes catch glimpses of his continuing presence moving through the canyons and desert regions where he had walked in life. But this was not the haunting presence of an unquiet spirit. Rather, it was the natural continuation of a soul so deeply connected to the land that death had simply transformed him into another aspect of its protective power. The network of Apache families that Jacob had helped reunite grew stronger under Maria's guidance, developing into a sophisticated system of cultural preservation that operated invisibly within the broader territorial society. Children learned traditional songs and ceremonies that had been passed down through generations, while adults found ways to practice ancient healing arts and agricultural techniques that had sustained their people for centuries. The artifacts remained hidden, but their wisdom flowed through the community like an underground river, nourishing Apache identity even as the external pressures of assimilation continued to intensify. As New Mexico moved toward statehood in the early years of the 20th century, Maria realized that Jacob's vision had extended far beyond simply protecting a collection of sacred objects. He had understood that the survival of Apache culture would require adaptation and flexibility, finding ways to honor ancestral wisdom while embracing necessary changes. The artifacts had never been meant to preserve the past unchanged, but to provide spiritual guidance for navigating an uncertain future. Maria began training multiple successors rather than relying on a single guardian, recognizing that the challenges facing Apache communities in the modern era would require distributed leadership and shared responsibility. Each new guardian specialized in different aspects of the ancient knowledge. Some focused on healing practices, others on agricultural wisdom, and still others on the complex spiritual ceremonies that connected living people to their ancestors. This expansion of guardianship ensured that no single person would ever again bear the full weight of protecting Apache heritage alone. The influence of Jacob's work extended beyond Apache communities to touch the lives of sympathetic white settlers who had learned to respect indigenous knowledge and values. Ranchers who followed traditional Apache land management practices found their herds healthier and their ranges more productive than neighbors who relied solely on modern techniques. Doctors in territorial towns began incorporating Apache medicinal knowledge into their treatments, often with remarkable success in cases where conventional medicine had failed. These cross-cultural exchanges happened quietly and without official recognition, creating a subtle but significant shift in how different communities related to each other throughout the territory. The violence and mistrust that had characterized earlier decades of Apache-white relations gradually gave way to a more complex pattern of cooperation and mutual respect, built on the foundation of shared reverence for the land and its natural rhythms. Maria's own spiritual evolution continued to deepen her understanding of the artifacts and their purpose. She discovered that the ancient objects were not merely passive repositories of knowledge, but active spiritual entities that could influence events across vast distances and long periods of time. The artifacts had somehow guided Jacob to each person and situation where their intervention was needed, and they continued to provide similar guidance to Maria and her fellow guardians. This realization led Maria to understand that her role was not just to protect the artifacts, but to serve as a channel for their ongoing influence in the world. She learned to recognize the subtle signs that indicated when and where the ancient wisdom was most needed, traveling throughout the Southwest to places where the balance between human ambition and natural harmony was under threat. Like Jacob before her, Maria became a legendary figure whose appearances at crucial moments helped preserve what was most valuable about the relationship between people and land. The final revelation of Maria's guardianship came when she realized that the artifacts themselves were gradually transferring their essential knowledge into the collective consciousness of the Apache people they had been created to serve. The physical objects were beginning to show signs of age and wear that had been mysteriously absent during Jacob's lifetime, suggesting that their spiritual energy was now flowing into living carriers rather than remaining concentrated in ancient vessels. This transformation represented the ultimate fulfillment of Jacob's mission and the completion of a spiritual cycle that had begun generations before his birth. The artifacts had served their purpose as protectors and preservers of Apache wisdom during the most dangerous period of cultural disruption and potential extinction. Now that a stable network of guardians and practitioners had been established, the ancient knowledge could live and grow within human hearts and minds, rather than being locked away in hidden objects. Maria understood that she was witnessing the end of one phase of Apache spiritual evolution and the beginning of another. The scar that had marked Jacob as a bridge between worlds had faded from his body at death, but its spiritual equivalent had multiplied into dozens of living connections between past and future, ancestors and descendants, traditional wisdom and contemporary challenges. The artifacts would continue to exist and be protected, but their primary function had shifted from preservation to inspiration, reminding each new generation of guardians about the sacred responsibilities they carried forward into an uncertain but hopeful future. In her final years as senior guardian, Maria established the ceremonial traditions that would guide future generations in maintaining their connection to Jacob's legacy and the ancient wisdom he had died protecting. These ceremonies combined traditional Apache spiritual practices with new elements that reflected the unique historical experience of survival and adaptation that had shaped their community over the past century. The story of Jacob Redfeather and his burning scar became a teaching story that was passed down through Apache families, reminding each new generation that the most profound spiritual awakenings often come through suffering, and that the greatest treasures are those we hold in trust for future generations rather than possess for ourselves.